Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 55 of Dollar Dialogue, Suriname's currency crisis and the fight for stability, the Gilder to SRD with Priscilla Bhawan. So today's episode is very interesting as we tune into South America, to Suriname, a small nation just over half a million people, and we'll unpack a currency story that illustrates big lessons in economics. The Surinamese dollar or SRD is more than just a medium of exchange. It's a mirror of governance, resource dependency, and public trust. And most of all, it sheds light into critical economic theory. For our episode today, we have our guest speaker, Priscilla Bhawan. She was an exemplary student at the Yale Young Global Scholars, and it's truly a privilege to have her on the podcast to shed light on the Surinamese economy. She's currently a junior at a school which I cannot pronounce. I think it's better if she'll pronounce it. And yeah, we're just excited to have her today at the podcast so that she can share her nuances and insights into Suriname. So, Priscilla, is there anything else that you would like to add to the introduction that I've said?
Yes, I am actually a senior at Scholengemeenschap Nikeri.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Um, so to delve straight into chapter or like the first segment of today's podcast of Dollar Dialogue, it's better if you like get into the roots of instability. So Suriname's economy leans heavily on natural resources, and this is what I learned in chemistry class, that bauxite was once the backbone, but gold and oil now dominate the Suriname's economy. And in 2021, gold alone accounted for nearly 80% of export earnings and 40% of government revenue. So this makes Suriname highly vulnerable to swings in global commodity prices, and this is a textbook case of what we call resource curse in economics. And the problem with Suriname's economy is that when gold prices fall, government revenue essentially collapses, trade deficits widen, and the Surinamese dollar loses ground. For instance, while researching, I found that during the commodity downturn of 2015 and 2016, Suriname's GDP shrank by 5.6%, which is quite a lot for an economy. And inflation spiked over 55%. So instead of cushioning these shocks with strong institutions and diversified industries, the country has long relied on borrowing. Public debt ballooned from 48% of the GDP in 2015 to over 150% of the GDP in 2020, and this is one of the highest ratios in Latin America. Additionally, I think weak governance has amplified the crisis because successive governments financed budget deficits by printing money, which sort of eroded the consumer confidence in the Surinamese dollar. Also, there has been corruption scandals. For example, at the central bank, there was a revelation in 2020 that $100 million in foreign reserves had been secretly used for debt payments, which sort of further undermined the credibility of the central bank. And to give some brief context, the Surinamese dollar introduced in 2004 was at one SRD is equal to 1,000 guilders, which was supposed to restore stability. Instead, it faced repeated devaluations. By 2020, inflation surged past 61%, and the SRD lost more than half its value against the US dollar. So, everyday goods from rice to fuel doubled in price within months. Households responded rationally by saving in dollars and euros or even bartering, and a dual exchange rate emerged with a black market rate often 30 to 40% weaker than the official one, which sort of undermined the monetary policy. And to give another brief context, as a result of this, Surinamese economy had to turn to the IMF for a $690 million, essentially a bailout, agreeing to slash subsidies, raise taxes, and restructure its debt. And these measures aim to restore fiscal discipline, but they come at a cost. Full prices rose by over 40% in a single year, as well as food insecurity deepened. So therefore, we can see that Suriname's economy is a classic case where government faces an economic dilemma, which is balancing short-term pain with the long-term gain. And as a result, Suriname's future depends on whether reforms can actually build trust in institutions, but more importantly, its currency. So with this information being said, Priscilla, would you like to share any sort of your personal insights of living in Suriname, and how have you experienced inflation or even the devaluation of the currency? Or Mr. Supreeth Nagella or Mr. Shahzaib Karim, you are welcome to chime in as well.
Yeah, Arib, I can chime in. I think I agree with your background, and I think moving on to today, there are some cautious signs of improvement because we can see that the government has begun restructuring debt with major creditors, and the exchange rate is considered to be weak still, but it has shown moments of stabilization, and although inflation is still high, it has started to cool down compared to when they were going through hyperinflation, and they're also more optimistic because of the oil discoveries, and Suriname could follow in the footsteps of using oil well to boost their growth.
Thank you, Mr. Shahzaib Karim, for that very insightful response. Mr. Supreet Nagala, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in? I see Mr. Supreet Nagala is having technical difficulties. Priscilla, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in as well?
Yes. So, as you asked about my like experience to live in Suriname during these days, especially when there's like inflation and currency devaluation. Am I right? Like
Yeah.
Yeah,
personally,
yeah.
the groceries and essentials, like price of basic foods like rice, cooking oil, and flour, changed so rapidly that some families rushed to the supermarket as soon as they got their salary, knowing that the prices might be higher the following week. And the dollarization of trust. Many people, including my own family, I try to keep saving in US dollars or euros since the Surinamese dollar kept losing value. This meant that even small remittances from relatives abroad carried enormous weight. And also, like the bartering and scarcity, sometimes instead of exchanging in SRD, neighbors traded items directly. For example, fuel for groceries, especially when shortages or price spikes made goods hard to find. And a lot of for youth and opportunities for students and young professionals, inflation made dreams feel more expensive, especially if someone wanted to go ahead and study abroad, because the inflation kept coming, but the salary of the people stayed. Like it was pretty much not stable. Everyone's situation at home, I would say, for most of the part, the crisis affected them a lot, and I feel like a lot of students also had to like give up on their dreams, which is kind of sad. And the psychological pressure, inflation wasn't just about money, it was about stability. People stopped trusting in the SRD, and that mistrust bled into institutions like banks and government offices. It created a cycle of frustration where corruption scandals made the pain feel even sharper because citizens felt leaders were failing them in times of need. Yes, that was.
Thank you, Priscilla, for that very deep personal anecdote. So, Mr. Supreet Nagala, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in this time? Oh no, Mr. Shahzaib Karim. Apologies.
Yeah, basically, Arif, since you mentioned that Suriname had to default on international loans, I just wanted to ask, what were the consequences of that default for the government and the citizens of Suriname?
Priscilla, would you
Okay.
like to answer that? Yes.
Yes, that's a really important point. When Suriname defaulted on its international loans, the government basically lost a lot of credibility with foreign investors. But for regular citizens like me, the consequences weren't abstract. They were very real. I remember my family talking about how prices for everyday goods just kept climbing, and it felt like our money was shrinking in our hands. For example, I used to go to the market with 100 SRD and could buy enough groceries for a few days. After the default of the and devaluations, that same amount barely covered a few basic items. Another thing I noticed was the uncertainty. People were afraid to keep their money in the bank because no one trusted what would happen next. Some of my neighbors started buying dollars and euros almost immediately after payday just to hold some value. It made me realize how fragile confidence is. Once people lose trust in a currency, it's hard to rebuild it. So, while the government faced pressure from the outside world, for citizens, it meant living with rising costs, cutting back on meals, and constantly adjusting how we manage our money. It's one thing to hear about debt restructuring in the news, but it's another thing to experience the stress in your own household. Yes.
Thank you for that personal anecdote. Mr. Supreet Nagella, I said that your hand is raised.
Yes, actually. So Suriname is a resource-rich place, and we know there's a lot of gold, oil, and bauxite, and that's the stuff that on paper should make a country wealthy. But the thing is, instead of stability, Suriname has been living through currency collapse, inflation spirals, and debt defaults, as we've already discussed. But in the mid 2010s, Suriname was riding the commodity boom. Gold and oil money was flowing in, the government was spending, and people thought the guilder to dollar switch might bring stability. But then the global market crashes. Gold price tumbles, oil prices dive, and production grinds almost to a halt. Suddenly, all those US dollars that used to come into Suriname reserves were gone. And when your economy depends on those exports to pay for imports, to pay debts, to defend your country, you would end up in big trouble. So, what did the government do? First, they started overspending, keeping up with subsidies, public sector wages, pensions, while revenue was tanking. That's like that's like maxing out your credit card, for instance, while your paycheck just got cut in half. And then foreign reserves started drying up, and that was when the central bank couldn't defend the currency anymore. That's when devaluation, the inevitable, happened, like Arib already discussed. And then, as Priscilla also added with a personal anecdote, people started losing trust. And you could see lines outside currency exchanges where people were desperate to grab US dollars before the SRD dropped again. And now in 2021, Suriname has striked a deal with the IMF. And that meant that prices shot up, the fuel subsidies were gone, electricity subsidies were cut, and everyday life became painful because groceries started costing 30, 40, 50 more percent more than in just a few months, like what Priscilla just mentioned. And then there's also the debt crisis because even though they were trying to negotiate with India, private creditors, even like China, there was no clarity and no investor confidence. So the what makes this country and the problems it faces even more wild is a cycle, because devaluation would feed inflation, and inflation destroys trust. So then people run to dollars and gold, draining reserves, and without reserves, the cycle keeps on spinning. So my question is, uh, what do you think is the single most important reform or change that could realistically restore long-term confidence in the SRD and the economy?
Mr. Shahzaib Karim, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
Yeah, sure, Arib. First of all, I like to say that I agree with Supreet, and I think Supreet answering your question, I'd say that the most important reform is to restore the confidence in the currency would be to I think would be to strengthen the independence and credibility of the central bank, because when the citizens see the central bank as politically influenced or prone to printing money, they immediately lose faith in the value of the currency. And I think by enforcing stricter, more harsher limits on the money creation, and also ensuring like transparent policies, this would this would like indicate that the government is sending a clear signal that inflation will be kept under control. And I think also fiscal policies also matter. But if the government keeps overspending, the central bank's credibility won't hold. And I think restoring the trust starts with giving people confidence that their savings won't just evaporate overnight due to the poor monetary policies.
Thank you, Shahzaib. Priscilla, I see that your hand is raised.
Yes, so back to Supreet's question. I think the single most important reform to restore long term confidence in SRD and the economy is strengthening institutions, particularly the central bank and fiscal management. In Suriname, the repeated cycles of devaluation and inflation haven't only been about external shocks, they have been about weak governance, overspending, and lack of transparency. A realistic path forward would involve three key things. I think it should be first restoring central bank independence so that monetary policy decisions aren't driven by short term political needs, like printing money to cover deficits. Second, broadening the economy beyond the commodities like gold and oil. So what so that when global prices drop, the government isn't left without revenue. And third, ensuring transparency and accountability in public finances because corruption scandals like the misuse of reserves in 2020 directly erode confidence in the SRD. If these structural reforms are implemented, then IMF support and debt restructuring can actually work in the long run. Without them, people will continue to dollarize their savings and mistrust in the local currency no matter how many short term fixes are tried.
Thank you, Priscilla, for that very insightful response. I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And to continue our talking about the solutions, I believe another solution that that we haven't really talked about is unifying the exchange rate. So currently, the Surinamese parallel market rates undermine the central bank's confidence. So a floating but credible exchange system backed by an adequate reserve can reduce the arbitrage that we see happening currently against the SRD. And for example, Ghana took this path in 2019, and this African nation actually saw quite success. So unifying exchange rate is something that Suriname could do, especially given that the black market is pretty significant over there. Also, we talked a lot about tightening the monetary policy. So while the central bank must credibly reduce the money supply, it also by no means me that also means no more monetizing deficits. So printing money to pay bills essentially. An independent central bank mandate should be made, like Brazil's inflation targeting framework, which could anchor expectations. Additionally, there are problems regarding the emergency social protection. The IMF programs often raise fuel and food prices, as you just mentioned. But so to prevent unrest, targeted transfers and food subsidies for the poor households can cushion the blow. For example, in US there is EBT for certain households below a certain income, so they can get like food at a lower cost. And there's also in Mexico. In episode 50, we're talking about the Mexico's Progresa program, which maintains reform momentum while protecting the vulnerable. Also, in medium term, Suriname's public debt rose over 120% of GDP, and economically, this is unsustainable. So, debt restructuring combined with credible medium term spending rules like a cap on deficit relative to GDP is vital. For example, Jamaica's fiscal responsibility law is a regional model that other countries in the Caribbean and Latin America would follow. But most importantly, we must talk about dependence on gold. It's 80% of exports, which is actually in Bangladesh. RMG is also 80% of our exports, so that is a structural weakness. However, Bangladesh actually exports make up like 13% of our GDP, so that's not that significant. However, for Suriname, it's much more higher than that. So therefore, expanding into agriculture, ecotourism, and fisheries could broaden the export base. Also, if you look at neighboring countries like Guyana's, they have an emerging oil sector, and it's pretty risky, but it shows how resource rents can fund diversification if managed well. And also, I think one of the biggest problems is institutional failures. Transparency in institution is what probably the citizens need at this point. So therefore, transparency in public finance, like for example, publishing central bank reports, authentic reports, auditing reserves, and prosecuting corruption will help restore investor confidence. And without institutional trust, no macro reform can actually like stay in place. And for long term, I think we also need to talk about a sovereign wealth fund. For example, Norway's, for example, if you look at channeling resource revenues into a stabilized pension fund that could smooth out commodity shocks. For example, Norway's government pension fund is the gold standard. But even Botswana's diamond-funded SWF shows how small states can succeed. And lastly, we need to talk about specialization, because human capital at the end of the day, due to Suriname's small population, is a factor that we must consider. A small educated population is Suriname's best hope and best hedge against volatility. So spending on education and vocational training could help pivot towards service sectors like IT, logistics, and regional trade. Also, they could join supply chains in the CARICOM or the Caribbean community, or deepen trade ties with Brazil, which could expand markets beyond the narrow domestic base. And this would also reduce dependency on volatile global commodity prices. So at the end of the day, what it really comes to is, at the heart of it, no reform works without restoring trust. So citizens must trust that their money will not evaporate overnight. Investors must trust fiscal data is not manufactured, it's not made up, and also international partners must trust the government to implement reforms. So with that being said, to move on to the next segment of the podcast, I think it's important to understand the social cost of currency collapse. For example, if we zoom into people's life, how do Surinamese citizens cope? For example, street vendors pricing in US dollars, or families converting salaries to euros the same day they're paid, or informal trust networks emerging where neighborhoods pool remittances from the Netherlands to survive. So this shows how currency instability doesn't just weaken GDP numbers, it reshapes society itself. I think for our viewers, it's better if we look at Suriname and the IMF experiment. Just like Greece's austerity measures, Suriname and the IMF experiment is somewhat on the opposite side, but it's very important for us to recognize. For example, to give some context, by 2021, Suriname had a 690 million IMF package, and this is one of the largest relatives to its economy in the hemisphere. But reforms cut subsidies and raised fuel prices by 40% in a year. And here we would like to unpack why IMF medicine often poisons like prison, the politics of austerity in small states, and can trust in SRD be actually restored, or is dollarization inevitable? So, with that being said, Mr. Shahzaib Karim, Mr. Supreeth Nagella, or Priscilla, could you guys please elaborate or give some insights as to your opinion whether the IMF experiment in Suriname was successful or a failure? Objectively, of course. I said, Mr. Shahzaib Karim, your hand is raised.
Yeah, Arib, uh, I think the IMF loan was a mixed story for Suriname because on one hand it was necessary because by 2021 to 2020 by 2022 to 2021 Suriname had defaulted on debt and inflation. And so without the IMF stepping in, the country risked a complete financial meltdown. And the IMF package, which was around $688 million, give gave Suriname breathing room to restructure their debt and stabilize its exchange rate. So it was necessary, but the success was limited because the loan came with strict austerity measures like higher fuel and electricity prices and subsidy cuts. And for many of the citizens of Suriname, this felt like more. This felt this added more costs for them. This decreased private spending, and pro. This also increased the protests in Suriname, and social tensions also increased. So I think while the IMF's involvement, it reassured international creditors, but it didn't immediately translate into relief for households in Suriname. And I think as of now, there are some cautious signs of improvement because inflation has slowed compared to its peak, and the exchange rate has stabilized somewhat, and also debt negotiations are ongoing. So, yeah, I think whether the IMF loan will be remembered as a success really depends on the next few years. Yeah, Supreet and our guest speaker has their hands raised.
Yes, please go ahead, Priscilla.
Okay, thank you. I'd agree with Shahzad. I'd say that the IMF experiment in Suriname has actually been like a mixed picture because, like, As Shahzaud said, on one hand, the IMF deal gave the country breathing space by restructuring debt and providing emergency financing. Without that, Suriname probably would have faced an even deeper collapse with no access to reserves or international credit. In that sense, it was necessary, but if you look at the social side, the cost has been very high. Cutting subsidies on fuel, electricity, and food created sharp price hikes that hit ordinary citizens the hardest. Inflation spiked again, and households had to make really tough trade-offs just to afford like daily necessities. For many people, it felt like survival became harder and not easier. So, it was a success or failure. Was if it was a success or a failure, I'd say somewhere in between. The IMF program stabilized Suriname's position externally, but internally it hasn't yet rebuilt trust in the Surinamese dollar. If people continue saving in dollars and euros instead of SRD, then real stability is still far away. Long term success will depend on whether the government follows through with structural reforms as like improving transparency, diversifying the economy, and protecting the most vulnerable. If those reforms take hold, the IMF program could be remembered as a painful but necessary step, but if not, it risks being seen as just one another cycle of austerity that deepened mistrust in the system.
Thank you so much, Priscilla, for your insights and personal anecdotes. I completely agree with you. And if I'm being honest, I personally would say that the IMF's intervention in Suriname was more of a failure than a success, at least in the way it affected everyday people on the short to medium term, because on paper the programs made sense: floating the currency, reducing fiscal deficits, restoring reserves, and theoretically bringing stability to the SRD. But the reality on the ground was very different. Prices of basic goods skyrocketed, fuel and electricity subsidies were slashed. Families suddenly had to make impossible choices just to survive, and protests erupted across the country. Trust in the government, as already underscored several times, was eroded almost as fast as the SRD itself. And for most people, the IMF didn't feel like a lifeline anymore. It felt like a blueprint for austerity that hit them hardest. Now, I'll also give the IMF credit where it's due. These programs are meant to put in place the framework for long-term economic stability. In theory, if governance improves and the economy starts growing again, the measures could work. But in Suriname's case, the social cost was massive and the timing was brutal, and the people paying the price are the ones least able to absorb it. So, yes, in theory, there's potential for success, but right now, I'd have to call the intervention a sort of failure in practice, because it didn't protect the people it was supposed to help. And until social trust, wages, and living standards start recovering, it's hard to call it a real victory for the country. And also, Arib, as he had previously mentioned, wanted to also talk about the social cost of how all of this really feels for the people in Suriname. And yes, inflation rates and exchange rates are just numbers, but if you're actually living there, then you won't know how difficult life actually gets. Imagine walking into the market and seeing that the stuff you used to buy for a week now costs almost double. Rice, cooking oil, even electricity, everything is more expensive. Families on fixed incomes are suddenly making impossible choices, either to pay the electricity bill, pay rent, or even buy food. And that's not just some abstract hardship that soon became into daily life. And of course, when life had become that hard, people had gotten angry. Protests actually broke out in 2023, where people stormed the parliament. And it's a country where economic pain doesn't just stay behind doors, and it's spilled onto the streets, into politics, and into communities. Then there's also another side you don't always see. People started leaving. skilled workers especially, causing causing the brain drain. And young people, they all started looking for stability abroad, and when they left, it's not just jobs that they took, it's knowledge, ideas, and the energy to rebuild. And let's also be real, it's exhausting. The families are stressed, anxious, every price hike is a hit, and every currency drop is another worry. So even mental health takes a silent beating day after day. And even education suffers. School fees, supplies, textbooks, suddenly all of it is harder just to afford. And this reduces the skilled workers made. And some kids could even be pulled out of school. So this wasn't just a financial crisis, it soon became into a social one, touching the next generation too. So, Priscilla, since you have seen some stuff on the ground, which of these social costs were the hardest and why?
Oh, okay, Supreet. Thank you for the question. Uh, so for my personal experience, I would say that it was um more about, for example, as a student going to school, the prices, if you want to like buy something in the canteen, it was way more expensive than it used to be, like even double the price than we're used to. And generally, as a citizen, my father also has like a mini supermarket here, so we sell stuff and all. So I really saw the price changing drastically. For example, let's say 2 liters of Coca-Cola was 16 SRD, but today that same Coca-Cola costs 95 SRD. So I personally experienced and saw a lot of clients, like people coming, them not being able to afford these basic necessities or like food, rice, and everything. I'm sorry, I'm a bit lost on what your question was. So could you please emphasize once again on it?
Yes, of course, no problem. I was just wondering which of these social impacts hit you and your family the hardest. Hello?
Yes, Mr. Nagella, could you please repeat your question?
Again? Okay. So, what was the most impactful social impact on your life and your family, Miss Priscilla, Miss Bhavan?
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, I would say the inflation and cost of living, like for my family, the prices of basic goods, like I mentioned, like flour, rice, uh, and cooking oil skyrocketed. Fuel and electricity subsidies were cut, making transportation and utilities much more expensive. So my family had to make like tough choices between food, medicine, and school. Second would be, I would say, health impact, because people delayed or skipped medical care because it became unaffordable. Malnutrition risk increased, especially for children. Mental health suffered too, as financial stress weighed heavily on families. And further education impact, like school fees, supplies, and textbooks suddenly became way harder to afford. Some children were at risk of dropping out, some of my friends, and this directly affects the number of skilled workers in the future. I feel like it's creating a really long-term social cost. And yes, that was it for my part, I'd say.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Priscilla. And I think adding on, I'm not a citizen of Suriname myself, but like, this is another social impact that Supreet mentioned, the brain drain, which is significant. I think it had a significant impact on the citizens of Suriname, and as you have mentioned, Priscilla, it really impacted your education center, and we know how significant education is. It's the future of the country, and I think.
Apologies, viewers. I think Mr. Shahzaib Karim is currently facing internet difficulties. So to continue on with the podcast, we hope Mr. Shahzaib Karim regains his internet. So to continue with the podcast, I think it's better if we delve into actually the success of IMF. And I would say to like conclude on that segment, I would say in my opinion, and in economics, like in class, Mr. Spivey told us not to be absolute, but I would say here we can be absolute in the sense that the IMF has fallen short, so it can be seen as a failure. So I agree with Supreet on that part, as the inflation is still high. So despite the IMF program in 2021, it has been like what since 4 years. Suriname's inflation in 2022 was around 52%, and in 2023 it remained above 30%, which is far from macroeconomic price stability. The currency is still weak. The SRD depreciated sharply after reforms. So in 2021, USD was around 7.5 SRD, and by 2023, it hovered around 30 SRD in the parallel market. So trust in the local currency hasn't been rebuilt. And social pain, the one that we were talking about right now, it's clearly seen even in our guest speaker's live that fuel subsidies were cut, prices rose more than 40% in 1 year, and food insecurity spiked. So citizens bore the brunt, and this sort of sparked protest and eroded political support. Credibility-wise, corruption scandals at the central bank didn't help either, and delays in implementing fiscal reforms weakened the public faith in IMF-backed programs. However, it can be seen as a success in some ways, as the debt restructuring progress meant that Suriname renegotiated with bondholders and China under IMF guidance, and it erased its 150% debt to GDP crisis. External debt service has also become more manageable. However, if you look at the fiscal discipline, the government has introduced measures to cut deficits, broaden the tax base, and improve revenue collection. And primary deficits actually narrowed in 2022 and 2023 fiscal year. Additionally, internationally, they have become more credible as IMF involvement signaled to investors and multilaterals like the Inter-American Development Bank that Suriname was serious about reforms, unlocking more external support. So overall, judgment-wise, short term, if you look at it, it's a failure as rising living cost, weaker SRD eroded purchasing power of consumers. Medium run, economically, it is a fragile success, a success nevertheless, as stabilizing debt and laying the groundwork for fiscal balance is happening or is like taking place at its initial stages. And in the long run, which is like future, success will depend on whether Suriname can diversify beyond gold and strengthen institutions. Otherwise, the IMF cycle risks repeating like in Argentina. So with that being said, the next segment of our podcast, I think it's better if we now delve into what are the possible future for Suriname. And I personally think it can be seen. There are three options. Firstly, the first option to me is the three paths for the SRD. So we can. So in my opinion, we can sort of frame the three paths for SRD in the sense of stability, dollarization, and the collapse part. So, firstly, Suriname now stands at crossroads, and the future of Surinamese dollar will depend on which three possible paths the country follows. The first is, as I mentioned, the stability path, where IMF reforms take root and credibility slowly returns. Inflation, which ran above 50% in 2021 and still hovered around 30% in 2023, could fall into single digits by 2026 if fiscal discipline holds, debt restructuring continues, and the central bank refrains from monetizing deficits. This would gradually restore confidence in SRD, allowing businesses to price goods without fear of overnight swings and encouraging households to save in local currency again. And the second possibility is dollarization, a step already half taken in practice. Many salaries, rents, and even groceries are priced in US dollars or euros. An official move which is to adopt the dollar, as Ecuador did in 2000, El Salvador in 2001. And this actually brought immediate stability by anchoring expectations to a strong foreign currency. If I'm not mistaken, Argentina has also pegged its currency to the dollar, and the trade-off is that you permanently lose your monetary sovereignty. However, it does make your country more stable. So the ability to respond flexibly to domestic shocks actually increases quite a lot. And for a small resource-dependent economy like Suriname, that would mean surrendering one of the few tools it still controls, which is their monetary sovereignty. Because if they're pegged to the dollar, then the dollar would control, not Suriname. And since US and Suriname are different economies, it actually would not make sense other than stability. And the third path is collapse. If reforms stall, subsidies creep back, or external shocks hit commodity revenues, the SRD could spiral into another crisis. Public debt, which peaked at over 150% of GDP in 2020, remains fragile even after restructuring. And without persistent policy discipline, another round of devaluation or even a redomination, a repeat of 2004's dramatic switch from 1,000 guilders to one SRD could be on the horizon. What makes this debate compelling is that Suriname's struggle is not about the economics but about also trust. Small shopkeepers in Paramaribo often keep two sets of books, one in SRD, another in USD. Families are receiving remittances from the Netherlands. Also, convert them immediately into durable goods, knowing the local currency may or may not hold its value even a week later. Teachers, police officers, and the nurses increasingly ask for partial salaries in dollars. These behaviors reveal a deeper truth. Once trusted money is broken, it cannot be easily rebuilt by policy decrees or IMF memoranda. Suriname's story is therefore both unique and universal. To me, it is unique in its small size and colonial legacy, but universal in its echoes of Argentina's inflation cycle, Zimbabwe's repeated denominations, and even Turkey's recent currency turbulence. And for young viewers of Dollar Dialogue trying to understand economics beyond the textbook, the lesson is clear. Currency stability is less about the paper in your wallet and more about the credibility of institutions behind it. For Suriname, the next few years will be decisive. If reforms deliver lower inflation, transparent governance, and a path toward diversification beyond gold and oil, which still make up 80% of export earnings, then SRD might finally shed its image as a fragile, crisis-prone currency. But if trust continues to erode, the Surinamese dollar risks becoming another chapter in Latin America's history of currencies that collapse under the weight of politics, debt, and broken promises. So, with that being said, what do you guys think is the solution Suriname should do, or the Surinamese government should implement, fiscal or monetary?
Yeah, Shreya, please go ahead first.
Okay, thank you. First you asked what the possible futures of Suriname could look like. I would like to add on it. One bright spot for Suriname is that now we have our first female president, which is historic and shows progress in representation and leadership. And she also stated that she will not be participating with IMF anymore. Apart from that, being a citizen and living in the city, I see every day how urban communities are hubs of innovation and education and social chains. So there's a real opportunity for citizens, especially young people, to contribute actively to the country's future. Some ways we can help include could be like supporting education and skills development, engage in civic participation, promote economic diversification and all that. But looking ahead, IMF currency and Suriname's future. Suriname has made some progress with IMF, especially in debt restructuring and reducing the debt to GDP ratio from over 150%, which has made external debt more manageable. So the government has also introduced measures to cut fiscal deficits, broaden tax base, and improve revenue collection. These are all steps in the right direction, according to me. And however, the SRD remains weak, the inflation is still high, and the parallel market exchange rate went from about 750 SRD per US to around 30 SRD by 2023, and now it's around like 40 SRD, which shows that trust in the local currency has not yet been restored. The price keep on increasing for food, fuel, and basic goods. It continues to hit the citizens hard, and social dissatisfaction is visible through the protests and growing public frustration, as you all mentioned. I think for the future, a few steps are crucial. First would be to stabilize the SRD. Continued monetary discipline and credible policies are needed to rebuild trust in the currency. Controlling inflation through careful interest rate and supply measures will help protect citizens' purchasing power. Implement IMF backed reforms effectively. Programs need to reach the populations, not just like work on paper. No subsidies, social protections, and tax measures don't disproportionately hurt vulnerable groups. It should avoid delays and ensure transparency to strengthen public confidence. I feel like diversifying the economy is also important. Reducing reliance on gold, oil, and bauxite is essential to make the economy less vulnerable to commodity price shocks. And urban areas like where I live in Ikeri. The capital city of Suriname is Paramaribo, and Ikeri could become hubs for new industries like technology and sustainable businesses that can strengthen the SRD indirectly by boosting productivity and exports. For the long term success depends on institutions and citizen engagement. Strong, transparent institutions will prevent corruption scandals from undermining fiscal and monetary progress. Citizens can help by supporting local business, advocating for good governments, and staying informed about economic policies. In short, I would say the IMF has had mixed results, short term social pain and continue currency weakness, but medium term success in debt stabilization and credibility with international investors. I would say the long term outcome depends whether Suriname can stabilize the SRD, especially because we have a new president since 2025 May, our first female president, and she does not want to cooperate and go back to IMF. I feel like if she manages to come up with a different approach, we maybe could have Suriname be in a better place than how it is now. I would not say that it would directly be way better, but I do think there is room for improvement.
Thank you so much for such an insightful perspective, and I really enjoyed how you provided different solutions to such a disastrous and long term problem. So, one idea that Ari mentioned is the dollarization. So, that's basically to just ditch the SRD and adopt the US dollar outright. And on paper, it does seem simple. No more currency devaluations, no more exchange rate chaos, right? Well, the thing is, things aren't always that simple. First, if you switch completely to the dollar, Suriname loses all control over its own monetary policy. So the central bank wouldn't be able to adjust interest rates, print money, or respond to local shocks anymore. And if the US raises rates again, Suriname has no say, and suddenly loans and borrowing get much more expensive for everyone, even if the economy is already struggling. And no, it's not just economics. Dollarization also comes with huge transition costs. Converting all wages, contracts, government accounts, even small business pricing is complicated and expensive. Plus, the country loses seigneurage, the profit, which is the profit it makes from issuing its own money, which matters for a small economy already tight on revenue. And let's be honest, there's a social side too. Some people feel a loss of identity tied to the SRD. And yes, dollarization may stabilize things a little bit on the short term, but it's not the silver bullet. So, without fixing fiscal mismanagement, inflation, and public trust, the same problems will creep right back in. And yes, uh, there definitely are arguably better paths like Priscilla already mentioned. And for starters, Suriname could adopt a managed float by letting the SRD adjust and also intervening strategically to prevent wild swings and tightening monetary policy and targeting inflation while protecting the most vulnerable with targeted subsidies could help really too. And you mentioned, Priscilla, that diversification is key. And I agree with you. Suriname relies heavily on commodities like gold and oil, which are very volatile. And investing in agriculture, tourism, small manufacturing, or even digital services could bring in more stable foreign currency. As you already mentioned, I completely agree with you. But my question to you is realistically, that's not so easy. Agriculture and manufacturing need investment, infrastructure, and skilled labor. And tourism can also be volatile and depends on global demand. Digital services also require tech adoption and education that and education isn't that instant. So, given all these challenges, how feasible is diversification really in a short to medium term for Suriname? Could it actually help stabilize the currency on the short to medium term, or is it more of a long term dream?
Supreet, I think that was a very good question. I think to answer your question, to answer the question, I think as you mentioned before, it is a very challenging task given all the challenges that you'd mentioned. Because like and I think that's what indicates that this is something that will take time, and you cannot personally. I believe that achieving this in the short run, is is going to be it's going to be very hard to do. That's why I do believe that this is something that Suriname can they can envision this for the long term, because of course diversification, it will be very beneficial for the economy, but I think this is something that they have to envision for the long run.
Thank you so much, Shahzib. And in the short run, what should they do?
I think for the short term, as you guys have mentioned before, there are some things that they could implement that you had mentioned. But I think one of the most significant factors that I had also mentioned before is like the brain drain. I think they should aim to keep their education and their like their talented individuals within their economy to further like to make sure that their future generations are in good hands, and the economy in the future is in good hands. I think they really need to make sure that everyone in the economy, everyone in all the households are given that there's an equitable society, and everyone has the education that that they're entitled to. And I think this will benefit their economy a lot. And yeah, I think Priscilla, you have your hand raised.
Wait, Priscilla, before you share perspective, I just wanted to ask Shahzib one more question. You said education. Education is maybe like 7, 8 years, 7, 8, 9 years before they actually start making a big impact. So, on a day-to-day life, short term, what should they do?
Yeah, honestly, I was also thinking that education, it will take some time for it to have effects. But I think in short run, what they could do, um, I think what Suriname could do in the short run is probably like um I think they could implement subsidies. Subsidies would have an impact almost more immediately. And I think another factor is also being transparent. But what I mean by that is like they should, like the central bank and the government, they're two separate entities. And I think them operating as two separate entities will increase consumer confidence, and this would increase consumer spending in the economy. And I think this will in the short run, as you wanted me to answer, Supri. I think this would increase spending in the short run, and therefore improve the output in the economy if the consumer confidence increases. And I think this could be done through the transparency between the central bank and government itself.
Thank you so much, Shahzib. Very
Yeah,
insightful.
thank you.
And
So I hope that answered your question, Supri.
yes, it definitely did. Thank you so much. And Shreya, you wanted to say something?
Yes, Supreet, I wanted to add just about what you said about diversification. I totally agree. It's coming from a really realistic point of view. So, realistically, diversification in Suriname is possible, but it won't happen quickly. In the short term, agriculture, manufacturing, and tourism face significant challenges. They require investment in infrastructure like skilled labor and technology, all of which take time and resources. So, tourism and exports are also subject to global demand and price fluctuations, so they can't immediately stabilize the economy. In the medium term, however, there is potential. Suriname has fertile land for agricultural opportunities and ecotourism, and if I'm correct, about 90% plus of Suriname is like forested. And um, so and the growing urban population that could support small manufacturing and digital services. So, developing these sectors could gradually increase foreign currency inflows, which would help strengthen the SRD and reduce reliance on volatile commodities like gold and oil. That said, diversification alone won't fix the currency overnight. Short term measures like targeted subsidies, fiscal discipline, and careful monetary policy are still necessary to protect citizens and stabilize the SRD. Over time, if these strategies are combined, diversification can realistically support a more stable currency and a stronger economy, but it's a gradual process. It's not an instant solution. But like practically what you asked Shazab for like the short term on a day-to-day life, what people can do, I think they should budget carefully, like track daily expenses and prioritize essentials like food, medicine, and transport, reduce non essential spending where possible. They should shop smart, buying local products when it's possible, and as important goods are often more expensive due to the weak SRD. They should take advantage of markets and community exchanges for lower cost goods. They should also, I feel like, manage currency exposure if possible, keep some savings in more stable currencies like US or euros for emergency expenses, right? Avoid high interest loan in foreign currency unless absolutely necessary. So I feel like they should also invest in skills, short courses, online learning, or vocational skills can improve employability in sectors that are growing locally. So in day-to-day life, in the short term, it requires careful budgeting, smart shopping, resource conservation, and community support. These small steps don't solve the currency or inflation problem, but they can help families manage the immediate pressures while medium and long-term economic strategies like diversification take effect. Thank you.
Thank you, Priscilla, for the very insightful response. I wholeheartedly agree with that. So to wrap up today's podcast for Dollar Dialogue, I would actually say that at the end of the day, Suriname's currency story is more than just exchange rates or IMF reports. For viewers worldwide, I think it's a reminder that money is never just numbers on a screen or paper in our wallet. It's a contract between a government and its people, and between citizens and themselves. It's basically a social contract, as John Jacques Rousseau says, and this is what our one of the instructors from YYGS would actually agree with that. His name was Mr. David Adaogo, and he also agreed with that economics and politics go hand in hand. So when it breaks, the social contract breaks, money loses its meaning, and people are forced to improvise, pricing goods in dollars, hoarding foreign cash, or turning to informal networks of trust just to survive. So Surinamese dollar shows us how fragile that contract can be. The country has already lived through devaluation, inflation above 50%, net levels that soared to 150% of GDP. Priscilla's personal anecdotes also showed those numbers fructify into real life situations. The IMF reforms have also offered a lifeline, but the pain of subsidy cuts and rising costs have made many wonders if the cure is worse than the disease. So whether the SRG survives as a credible currency will depend less on its design and more on whether institutions can earn back public trust, because in economics, as in life, credibility is cheapest and most powerful currency of all. And here's the big takeaway from for all of us: whether you're in Dhaka, Lagos, Sao Paulo, or Paramaribo, inflation, debt, and devaluations may seem far away until they're not. So Suriname reminds us that stability isn't guaranteed; it's built day by day through transparent governance, fiscal discipline, and above all trust. So that's a real lesson. Currencies collapse not when paper runs out, but when belief in them does. So as we close today, remember the story of Surinamese dollar is not just a local crisis; it's a universal question, and the question is, what does it take to make money mean something? So, with that being said, Priscilla, is there any final words you would like to say before we wrap up the podcast for today?
I would say thank you very much for having me today. And I'm so glad that I could share some insights about as a citizen of Suriname and how life here is. So yes, and I would like to add to the story of Suriname's currency. It really highlights how economics is lived and not just calculated. Like behind the numbers are families making daily decisions about food, school, and healthcare, and that is where the social cost hits the hardest. Looking forward, the SRD can regain credibility, but it won't happen overnight. It depends on diversification, on strong institutions, etc. Citizens, government, and the private sector all have a role to play, from supporting local industries to making informed financial choices in daily life. And perhaps the biggest takeaway is that money is ultimately a social contract. Suriname reminds us that this contract can be fragile, but with transparency, discipline, and citizen engagement, it can also be rebuilt. It's a lesson not just for Suriname, but for anyone watching anywhere in the world that trust is more powerful than currency of all. So, thank you everyone for having me. Yes.
Thank you, Priscilla, for those personal anecdotes, and also for being on our podcast today. So, viewers, this is all for our episode today, episode 55, which was about Suriname's currency devaluation and its guilder versus USD comparison. So, thank you everyone for watching today's episode 55, and stay tuned for next week's episode 56, with another very interesting topic with another very interesting guest speaker. Thank you and goodbye.